Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today with a new video for my newer series in which I cover the factions and houses of Ice and Fire Total War, War for Westeros. This is a mod for the game Total War Attila that overhauls it and bases it in Westeros, the primary setting of Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and the A Song of Ice and Fire books. In particular, this mod is based off of the books, with the units and factions in it taking inspiration from their book counterparts as compared to the live action shows, which is something I appreciate. Because of this, the mod chooses to discard the visual style of the show. It means that a lot of the units in the game look more historically authentic for starters, which is nice to see and which is something we'll touch on later down the line. In this video I'll be breaking down the faction of the Iron Islands, specifically the sole house it has in its roster, House Greyjoy, looking at the history and inspiration behind the faction and its roster before turning to its units and looking at how historically authentic the units' arms and armour are. If you like the sounds of that and want to see more, like and subscribe and the content will keep coming. As of making this video, the mod is in the very early alpha, however even at such a stage, a lot of factions, units and maps already exist, which means there's more than enough content for me to cover for a while. Looking at the Iron Islands, they're an island archipelago to the west of Westeros, bordering the Westerlands, the Reach, the Riverlands and the North. For millennia, the locals have alternately been at peace with the mainland or raided it incessantly, sometimes doing both at the same time. The many different houses that vied for supremacy over the islands, at times establishing presences on Westeros that challenged the power of the local kingdoms. Indeed, by the time of Aegon's conquest, the most feared kingdom on the continent was the Kingdom of the Isles and Rivers, which ruled over the Riverlands and Iron Islands. A kingdom that, along with its leading house, House Hoare, would be burned away by the dragons of House Targaryen. In the aftermath, King Aegon would solve the issue of the power struggle left by the loss of House Hoare by giving command of the Iron Islands to one of its leading houses, House Greyjoy, who for the next 3 centuries would more or less control the islands, at times partaking in wars in Westeros, other times being peaceful, and others just raiding for the hell of it. During Robert's rebellion, House Greyjoy would nominally fight for the rebels, though the lord of the house would die and his elder son Balon would take over. Years later, he would rebel against the new King Robert, only to be crushed and spared. A mistake, given that in the chaos of the War of the Five Kings following Robert's death, Balon would attempt to secede again, ordering his forces to conquer the undefended north with the assistance of his turncoat son Theon. As of the most recent book, Balon has been murdered by his brother Euron, who was elected king and who has now pulled the Ironborn out of the north, and has instead begun attacking the Reach while sending forces to assist Daenerys Targaryen in her wars in Essos. In terms of historical inspirations for the Iron Islands and House Greyjoy, the most obvious one is an apt one, the Vikings of the early Middle Ages, who much like the Ironborn were people who lived on land poorly suited for agriculture or expansion, leading many men to take the sea to raid and conquer, the Ironborn quite literally using longships in the same style as the Vikings did to raid, although they do have larger warships available. A major aspect of the Iron Islands that rings true with Vikings are the possession of thralls, slaves taken in raids, which the Vikings were big followers of, although it should be noted that the Ironborn typically don't sell slaves and instead keep them on the Iron Islands, unlike the Vikings who would sell slaves far and wide. With all that said, we'll turn to the units, beginning by looking at the generals. Each faction normally having a heavy cavalry unit as a general, which is normally a regular unit in the roster, as well as a unique character from the books leading their own unit. That unique general for House Greyjoy is Asha Greyjoy, daughter of Balon, and his only useful child in my opinion. While the unit is called Asha Greyjoy, a more accurate name is Asha and her household guards, so I'm going to refer to the unit as such. Asha was the only one of Balon's children to survive his rebellion against the Iron Throne and stay on the Iron Islands, her brother Theon being taken away as a ward by the Warden of the North, Ned Stark. In the years that followed, she became an accomplished captain and raider who was popular with the Ironborn, helping her father plan out his new war, after which she would attempt to stake a claim to his throne following his death, though she would be forced to flee from her home by her uncle, leading to her capture in the north by the one true King Stannis Baratheon and his forces. Looking at Asha, she rides an unarmoured horse, which makes sense, given that the Ironborn aren't known for their prowess on horseback, and much like Vikings use mounted troops to travel quickly rather than fight while mounted. As is quite obvious, Asha lacks a helmet, which would normally be an instant reason for criticism given how important head protection is. However, in the Ironborn's case it's a bit different, given that it's said in the books, many warriors choose not to wear armour, or at least as little as possible while on ships in case of going overboard, where heavy armour would be a death sentence. That said, many other warriors in the books choose to wear armour while at sea, as wearing armour makes you that much more formidable compared to unarmoured foes and gives you a massive advantage. Combine that with the fact that the Ironborn worship drowning, and her choosing not to wear a helmet seems a little bit odd. Overall, I'll leave it to you guys in the comments to tell me what you think of the situation. Looking at the rest of her body, she wears a gambeson, padded textile armour to protect her torso, which is smart and makes sense for someone wanting to give themselves some level of protection while avoiding wearing metal armour. It's what's over the gambeson that throws off her look for me, and looks horrible, and that is the horrible fantasy-looking studded leather vest. Such a thing never existed historically and is purely a creation of opera outfits, which then ended up being brought further and further into pop culture by decades of horrible outfits from movies and TV shows, specifically shows about Vikings, like Vikings, where you often see them wearing this horrible stuff instead of real functional armour. Leather armour did exist, but it sure as hell wasn't studded like that. Attached to the studded leather vest are spolders which look fairly functional and provide good defense for the upper arms, looking like those worn by Roman legionaries of the early imperial era. Apart from that, she only has leather gloves and boots to protect her legs, being generally speaking lightly armoured. Instead of a shield, she instead chooses to dual wield, a simple one-handed axe in one hand, looking like the ubiquitous axes used by many warriors in the Middle Ages, be they Scandinavian raiders or soldiers, English ferdmen, or regular sergeants and levies, to axe used in conjunction with a dagger, which I think is meant to represent a sax knife, the common short blade used by the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, as a general purpose knife, as well as a stabbing weapon in shield war clashes. To round off her weapon, she also has a dagger at her side that looks more advanced, seeming like a 14th century dagger. Dual wielding was something that did happen historically, and especially for lightly armed and armoured raiders makes sense. Also, I'm pretty sure she is described as using two weapons at once in the books, so if anything, it's just the mod being accurate to the lore. Turning to her men, who I'm assuming are her crew, or the household guard of House Greyjoy, they ought to a man wear nasal helms which look a lot like those worn by the Normans, except these have cheek guards and go further down to protect the back of the neck, making it more of a Norman helmet crossed with a Migration era helmet and a bassinet, some of the warriors having mail cloths underneath their helmets which protect their cheeks and throats, and others having full face covering mail cloths that extend to become male standards over their upper chest, giving them a Kievan Rus vibe. These cloths actually don't make sense in a way, given that Migration era helmets with cheek guards were phased out when male cloths became popular, as the cloth protected the cheeks with the simple nasal helm, protecting the upper head, so it's odd to see cheeks with two layers of defense here. For their torsos, all the men wear either male shirts or halberds with sleeves ending at the elbow, some choosing to wear leather vests over the top, with some of them bearing the golden kraken symbol of House Greyjoy, and others being unadorned, some warriors instead having a male halberd over which they have a lamellar shirt. For the rest of their arms, all the men have very early vambraces looking to be made of leather strips or perhaps strips of metal instead of a solid plate vambrace, being similar to those worn by Migration era warriors, most having unarmoured hands, although some wear mail and leather gloves. Lastly, the legs seem to have a lot of variety when it comes to armour, some just having pollens to protect their knees combined with their leather boots, while others just have greaves looking straight out of the 15th century, while others have greaves, cuisses for their thighs, and mail shoes for their feet, making for a nice mix. Overall, the armour of these men make them seem like well-armoured warriors of the 11th and 12th centuries, albeit the anachronistic plate armour components could make them more akin to lesser armoured warriors of the late Middle Ages in Eastern Europe. Turning to their equipment, the troops have the classic round shields epitomised in the Migration era, the shields all being painted black and most bearing the House Greyjoy kraken upon them, showing off their loyalty. In conjunction with their shields, which are most notably used by the Vikings and their Anglo-Saxon foes, the troops use a mix of the archetypal Viking weapon, the axe. Some of the axes resemble the common hatchet axe used in the early to high Middle Ages, although some have metal shafts, which was typically used in the late Middle Ages. Some of the other axes having crescent blades with a variety of spikes on the opposite side of the blade, reminiscent of the advanced axes of the late Middle Ages used by knights as well as heavy cavalry in the Middle East. Some axes having etching on the blades, while others have them on the shaft. Overall, it's great to see this wide mix of one-handed axes, showing off in a way the evolution of axes over the Middle Ages. Axes and shields being a far more common sight than swords and shields, especially the further back you go in the period. With the troops looked at, we'll turn to the unit role. A gold tier 3 heavy melee cavalry unit. These guys aren't as great on the chart as dedicated shock cavalry, but can still output significant damage to enemies, being great at getting stuck in with clumps of foes. In addition to their melee skills, the unit also has a skirmishing ability, throwing axes at enemies, which means it can inflict a fair bit of damage at range before smashing into disorganized foes. As a unique general unit, I'd recommend these guys over the other potential general units of the faction fields, as it's relatively lackluster in comparison. A fairly useful and unique general unit given their skirmish abilities. I wouldn't say Asher and her household guard have the same raw firepower as some of the other general units available to other factions, but can still do pretty well all things considered. With Asher looked at, we'll move on to the regular units of the faction, beginning with the Greyjoy archers. Looking at the men, they're a good representation of what you'd expect your more basic archers with a modicum of military equipment to look like in the Middle Ages. Some of the men wear mail coifs underneath helmets which resemble a cross between a kettle helm with attached cheek guards and a German-style helm of the World Wars, given their short brim compared to normal kettle helmets. The rest of the unit lacks helmets, which is a shame given that normally if a unit is almost completely unarmoured, I can understand also not having helmets. However, these men are all armoured to some degree. Some in the unit wear leather shirts which seem to be less armour and more just harder wearing clothing, while others have a couple layers of padded clothing, and others still have an assortment of gambeson, some being dyed black and gold with the Greyjoy symbol, and others being unadorned, leather boots capping off the look. A nice attention to detail is that all the men have their forearms covered by their sleeves, which protects them from their bowstrings flapping them. At their sides, all the men have quivers of arrows ready to go, with everyday knives also hanging from their belts in case of combat, their main weapon being the pretty basic short bows they carry, which seem to be hunting weapons more so than weapons of war, which makes sense given these are levied villagers bearing arms from home for the most part. Looking at the unit officer, he wears a nasal helm with a gilded bar and central ridging for strengthening, a cloak pinned with a brooch being worn over his mail shirt, which is worn over a black tunic edged in gold, a nice touch showing off his Greyjoy allegiance. Apart from the helmet and shirt, the officer wears leather gloves and boots, a typical round shield adorned with a kraken used in conjunction with a Viking sword with its meaty blade and small crossguard. Very nice and historically authentic officer for sure. As a unit, these bronze tier 1 very light archers are the only archers the faction has, which means this unit's going to be critical to giving your army range support. More or less a match for most other beginning archers, these guys will be massively outmatched by the more advanced range units fielded by the other factions, which means you're not going to be able to rely on a defensive strategy of holding the line and weakening the enemy army into collapsing with concerted fire, this unit not being capable of doing so. Overall, a unit is going to see a hell of a lot of service, even if it's typically going to be on the back foot, the unit being even more critical in sieges where range support is everything. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Greyjoy Drowned Men. The Iron Islands, as I said earlier, practice a faith revolving around drowning, and the Drowned Men are their equivalent of priests, who are known for their martial skills, many of them being former raiders and warriors who turned to religion. Wearing only green and blue robes with a few wearing leather shoes. Some of the unit have van bases made of leather and metal, while others rely on their faith to protect their forearms, choosing not to use shields and instead just wielding driftwood shaped into clubs, a very basic weapon, especially against armoured foes, but one which can still cause a fair bit of damage, more so if attacked when not expecting it. Clubs saw a fair bit of use in the Middle Ages, specifically mauls, which were larger clubs, although they weren't typically someone's first choice of weapon, and were typically used by those who didn't have access to weapons such as spears or axes. Looking at the officer, he is distinguished by his hood and his weapon, which is a simple wooden staff, which much like the club, is capable of a lot of damage, although most weapons would be far more superior. As a unit, these bronze tier 1 very light macemen will make up the core of your army. This is one of the only two early game units the faction has, the other being the Greyjoy Archers. This means you can only really afford to go on the offensive in the early game, as these guys aren't a defensive unit and due to their complete lack of shields and armour, are highly vulnerable to shock cavalry and archers. Essentially, you're going to have to rely on the momentum of their charge and the fire support of your archers to break enemy lines, at least until better units become available. One of those better units are the Greyjoy Sword Raiders, who represent the Ironborn Reavers that the faction is known for. Looking at the men, they're well armoured, most wearing a mix of the kettle helms we saw before, as well as a variety of nasal helms, some with cheek guards and others lacking them, some of the unit also wearing the classic Viking helmet with a nasal bar and crossbars making for eye holes, some wearing mail coifs in conjunction with their helmets. Some men in the unit, however, skip helmets entirely, which is a stupid idea given that helmets protect the most important part of the body. Even the idea that they may have discarded their helmets due to not wanting to drown makes no sense, as they're still wearing mail armour, which is guaranteed to drown you if you go overboard, so all these men should be wearing helmets. Looking at their armour, they all wear mail shirts over gambeson, some having cloaks on their backs, all wearing leather boots, although a mix of leather gloves and leather and mail gloves are worn to keep the hands safe. Using the same shields we've seen before, the men all use Viking-style migration-era swords, though some have more chunky blades than others, with the thinner-bladed swords looking to be somewhat based on more later-period examples. Skipping the officer who's armoured like the Greyjoy Archer officer but without a gilded helmet, these men are your standard line infantry, being silver tier 2 medium melee infantry, being an all-around good unit and a far superior one to the drowned men. While I'd normally say these guys should be the core part of your armies, being the offensive arm of your infantry until heavier troops become available, the faction has another unit which performs better while being at the same level, completely outclassing these guys and making them obsolete, which is why I wouldn't recommend recruiting them. Apart from that, my only criticism of the unit is that they're solely sword infantry, as it would have been nice to see them using a mix of weapons like swords and axes. Moving on to the next unit, we have their spear equivalent, the Greyjoy Spear Raiders. Using the exact same armor and shields as the previous unit, these men are distinguished by their weapon, the ubiquitous spear. These spears having leaf-shaped heads for the most part, some having small langlets acting as wings to prevent weapons from going down the shaft. Skipping their sword-wielding officer, this unit will be the core of your army, especially in sieges when on the defensive. In open field battles, however, I advise using these guys as support infantry rather than as a defensive spear war, as due to the faction's lack of dedicated archers, turtling is a strategy that's only going to put you in greater danger of losing. Instead, go on the offensive and use these guys to keep your flank safe from enemy cavalry. Overall, a useful unit that will normally be a sight in Greyjoy armies, even if they're not the focus of the army. Moving on, we come to the next unit, and the only mounted unit the faction can field, the Greyjoy Mounted Raiders, essentially the spearmen on unarmoured horses. These silver tier 2 medium shock cavalry are not only the only horse unit you have, they're also your other option for general. Although given they have lesser stats than Asher, who herself is out-muscled by other cavalry, I wouldn't recommend them as general normally. As a unit, they're pretty useful as they give your forces much needed mobility and striking power, working well in concert with your offensive infantry to quickly collapse enemy forces. While I wouldn't use them as the core of your army, I would recommend including a few of them in your army just so you have options up your sleeves. Turning to the next unit, we have the catapult crewed by the Greyjoy archers essentially. This unit being ubiquitous to all factions and being one that is much needed, giving you fire support on the open battlefield if you choose to use artillery, and being critical in sieges, both as the attacker blowing holes in enemy fortifications and weakening defending infantry, and as the defenders, thinning out attacking armies and allowing counter battery fire on attacking catapults. Overall, a unit whose loss in your roster you would more than feel and which would be devastating. Turning to the next unit, we have the Greyjoy Chosen Swords, who are Asher Greyjoy's guards but on foot, discarding axes and instead using Migration era Viking swords in conjunction with their round shields. Skipping the officer with his gilded helmet, these guys are your silver tier 2 heavy sword infantry, a step up from the sword raiders who can also skirmish, throwing axes at the foe which gives them added flexibility and is a crucial bit of range firepower given the faction's significant lack of it, any throwing projectile being appreciated. It's because of this that these are the guys I advocate recruiting over the sword raiders, as these guys are them but just better, being my recommended core of your army, working well in tandem with the more offensive infantry the faction fields to break enemy lines. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Greyjoy Chosen Axes, who are quite literally Asher's guard but on foot. Skipping their officer, these silver tier 2 heavy axemen work amazingly well in conjunction with the Chosen Swords, both being the bulk of your infantry when smashing into enemy formations. A useful and formidable unit, my only complaint is that these guys in the previous unit shouldn't be two distinct units and should instead be one, given that a unit with a mix of swords and axes would have been better and made more sense in universe than a distinct unit of just shields and swords and shields and axes. Moving on, we come to the next unit, the Greyjoy Trappers. Wearing the same helmets and mail shirts we've seen before, the men wear a mix of either bronze or burnished lamellar cuirasses over their mail, while others wear scale cuirasses, such armour being more common in Eastern Europe and perhaps being an allusion to the Vikings who lived in the East and used Eastern armour such as the Kievan Rus and the Varangian Guard of Constantinople. In addition to this armour, the men have leather and metal van braces with all wearing leather boots, although some have puttees, that is to say wrappings on their shins for additional protection from the elements. Using the same shield seen before, these men have as their main weapon spears but with a hook at the side of the spear for grabbing foes' weapons and shields and pulling them aside, opening them up for attacks. Such attachments and more being seen later on in the Middle Ages as weapons evolved. Apart from that, the unit also carries javelins which it uses to skirmish with enemies, this being one of the few ranged units in the faction, and as such is at a premium. Skipping the standard officer, these guys are essentially the Greyjoy Spear Raiders but with skirmish capabilities, which you'd think would mean I'd recommend them over the Spear Raiders and essentially make that unit obsolete. However, the truth is that the unit is held back in one major way. It's unable to form up in shield walls, which means that for a spear unit that's meant to ward off cavalry, it's quite incompetent and incapable of making a wall of spears to send them off. It's for this reason I'd say still recruit spear raiders, however recruit a few of these guys to act as skirmishers when out of ammo, using them as supporting infantry for your main attacks. Overall, not the greatest unit in the world, but one who can still see service in the armies of House Greyjoy. Turning to the next unit, who seem to have their feet sliding into the ground, which seems like a bit of a mistake in the graphics, we have the Greyjoy Silence Men. King Euron Greyjoy captains a ship called the Silence, which is crewed by mutes, who I'm assuming these men to either represent or be a nod to. All the men seem to wear a male coif with a standard, the coif completely covering their face except for eye holes, which I believe was done historically and is depicted in certain period artworks. The men then wear a male shirt over which they wear a mix of lamellar and scale cuirasses with folds to protect the upper legs. Some wearing the same van base as seen before, while others have unprotected forearms, which seems like a massive vulnerability to me given how well armoured they are elsewhere. Apart from that, all the men wear boots, although some also seem to have pollens to protect the knees. Dropping shields, these men instead use massive two-handed axes that are essentially Dane axes. Giant axes used by the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxon Huskarls, who were capable of decapitating horses with such a weapon. Seeing the weapon here is great and more than makes sense in the hands of the essentially Viking faction in the mod. Skipping the officer, these gold tier 3 heavy shock infantry are numbered among the spear tip of your army, hacking a bloody path through enemy forces, though the lack of plate armor and shields does make them vulnerable to range attacks. I'd recommend using these guys as an armoured fist in battle, using as many as possible. The unit seeing use in siege is on the defensive as a unit with which to break overextended enemy offensives. A very cool and intimidating unit. Turning to the next unit, we have one of the coolest ones in the mod, the Greyjoy Cracking Guard, who I'm assuming are the personal bodyguard of the Lord of the Iron Islands, instead of just a regular household guard. All the men wear bassinets with a horsehair plume atop them, having a male coif with a standard that covers most of the face and a nasal guard with multiple cross pieces that gives extra protection to the face and resembles the ribs of a whale or large sea creature. Bringing to mind Naga's bones, the large ribs attributed to a mythical creature by the Ironborn, where they gather to elect their kings. For the rest of their bodies, the men wear arming shirts with what I'm assuming are male sleeves, over which they wear quilted gambeson, over which they have ornately decorated plate cuirasses with pauldrons, the plate components being gilded and engraved with the golden kraken of House Greyjoy, a cloak being worn over their shoulders, which is pinned with 2 gold and ruby brooches. Protecting their arms, the men have cowders for their elbows and plate greaves, leather and mail gloves capping off the look, while the legs are protected by a mix of leather boots and pollens, greaves and leather boots, and pollens, greaves, and mail boots, with some even having sabatons looking straight out of the 15th century. For weapons, the men have arming swords rather than migration era swords at their sides, these swords looking like they originate in the 1300s, while their main weapons are the halberds they use, with a spear tip, an axe blade, and a spike at the back, some having hooks instead of spikes. Halberds were a weapon often seen in the hands of royal guards in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, so it makes sense to see these men equipped as such. If anything, given how ornately they're equipped, it's pretty funny to look at the unit officer, who is a standard officer, who looks like a peasant levy in comparison to his men. As a unit, these gold tier 3 very heavy polearm infantry are a fearsome shock force who can endure more punishment than the previous unit and deal out incredible damage to enemy units. I suggest the same thing with these guys, using them as a spear tip for your professional armies, breaching enemy lines with them or keeping them in reserve to exploit enemy weaknesses. Overall, a very tough unit that more so than any other shows off the wealth and lordly status of House Greyjoy. Turning to the final unit in the faction roster, we have the Ironmaker Hammers. Starting with their heads, they wear mail coifs that cover their entire faces apart from small eye holes, bassinets with the same ribcage style faceplate as the previous unit being worn over the coifs. Turning to their torsos, they seem to wear tunics over which they have gambeson, over which they have a segmented plate hauberk, such armour being popular in the transitionary period between mail and plate in the 1300s. Rear braces in the same style protecting their upper arms, or their forearms have van braces and mail gloves for defence, the legs only really having leather boots and cloaks over their backs finishing off their look. Choosing to use two-handed weapons, their tool of choice are pole hammers, with 2 hammers with central spikes within them either side of the weapon, and a spear tip on top of the weapon's head, a metal rim on the head stopping the warrior's hands going fully up the shaft. Overall, a very cool and advanced weapon to see in this mod, such weapons being commonly seen in the hands of knights and men-at-arms during the late Middle Ages, where they were prized for their ability to kill armoured foes. Skipping their standard officer, these guys are yet another heavy assault unit available to the faction. These gold tier 3 super heavy shock infantry being yet another unit that I'd mix and match in your professional armies, being an additional bit of firepower that you'd more than appreciate when fielded. With these guys covered, all the units in the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to the faction as a whole. Overall, House Greyjoy of the Iron Islands are a faction that have a very specific focus, and that is on assault infantry, relying on rapid attacks by their infantry to carry the day, their specialization in heavy infantry not really being matched by many factions, especially when taking into consideration the severe lack of cavalry and range units that the faction suffers from. This causes House Greyjoy to have to be dynamic when it comes to combat, using overwhelming hordes of men to break enemy forces, be they on open land or in sieges, or risk being cut down by archers and horsemen working in concert. Overall, this means that the faction is a unique one, with its own dedicated playstyle that stands out from the competition. Although if naval assets are added to the mod, I'd expect the faction to be just as aggressive on sea as they are on land. My recommended army build at the end of the day would be as much offensive infantry of the highest caliber as you can gather, with limited amounts of archers and spearmen to support them. If you guys have enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments, and please like and subscribe. I know it may not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. Rest assured, more videos on this mod and others will be coming up in the future. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.